Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. Most spy stories are tales of daring do, caddish behaviour, betrayal, and often incompetence. Simon Kuper's recent biography of the KGB double agent George Blake is different. The Financial Times correspondent managed to interview Blake in Moscow in 2011. The result, a decade later, is a book that not only looks at Blake's career, but examines the game of spying and Blake's own conscience. It's here. It's a great read, and we're here to talk about it in more detail with Simon. Hello and welcome, Simon.
Hi.
Just to start with, let's refresh people's memories. Blake is seen as one of the most damaging spies to being recruited by the KGB within MI6, possibly sending dozens of agents to their deaths and betraying hundreds of others. And he was also famous for his almost comic escape from Wormwood Scrubs in Berlin, or sort of getting to Berlin in 1966. But I actually want to start with your scoop, and that scoop is in 2011, and that's actually getting to see Blake. How did that come about?
Well, I was very aware of Blake because in about 2000, I read an article in a Dutch magazine. Like Blake, I'm British, but I grew up in the Netherlands, one thing we have in common. And I read this article about this amazing Cold War spy, a Brit who became a secret KGB double agent, was now still alive and well, living in Moscow, and apparently very compos mentis and able to talk interestingly. And I thought, wow, what a story. I'd love to interview this man one day. And in 2012, actually, I was going to Moscow for a conference. And I have a Dutch friend there who is friendly with Blake, a guy called Dirk Sauer, who's a kind of media magnate in Moscow. He, among other things, he founded the Moscow Times. And so I said to Dirk, do you think Blake would give me an interview? So Dirk asked Blake, and I'm walking around a cemetery in Moscow one day looking for the graves of Chekhov and I think Khrushchev. And Blake calls me on my mobile. And Blake wants to interview me first to see what this is all about and who this person is and wants to interview him. And we speak Dutch, which I think pleased him and made him feel, kind of sentimental about the Netherlands. And he invites me to his house the next day. So I go there I've agreed to interview him for a Dutch newspaper, and I go there in Dirk Sauer's chauffeured car. And it's about an hour outside Moscow in this dacha, which Blake had been given by the KGB. And we spent 3 or 4 hours together. And I remember, I'm thinking, this is just a newspaper article. But I walk out after 3 or 4 hours of already having gotten along well with and enjoyed and been charmed by this very interesting, intelligent man. And I think, wow, that's really the most interesting interview I've ever done in my life. And I'm busy at that point. My kids are small. All my weekends I'm in the playground. And I just write it as a newspaper article, but it doesn't go away. And a couple of years
wasn't there a condition at the time as well? I mean, was there a sense that I'm going to give you this interview, but?
Yeah, so Blake was very happy to speak to a Dutch audience. He'd been away from Holland for 70 years. He'd been in the Dutch resistance. Then he fled the Netherlands in 1942 to go to London to be a spy. And he was very, felt very Dutch. He wanted us to speak Dutch, and he wanted to appear in a Dutch newspaper. But he said, look, don't write about me in English because my ex-wife and my sons, very conservative types living in Britain, they don't like it when their dad, the KGB agent, is written about. So I said, okay. And so I just wrote it in Dutch. But then later, these years later, when I began to think about a book, I said to Dirk, look, he asked me not to write it in English. What can I do? And Dirk said, when he dies, publish the book. And there'll be this whole wave of publicity about him anyway then. And so his ex-wife and sons will just have to deal with that. And your book won't make much difference. So that was the agreement, that when he died, I would publish this book in English, which I did.
Yeah, it's a great book. We've got the link. I think we're putting the link up in we have got the link in the chat box there. So if you want to find out where you can buy it, just have a look. That links you to the publisher's website. So wherever you are in the world, you can find out where to buy it. The book is really wonderful. There are insights into Blake's own conscience that we'll come on to. And also, I think what we call the establishment and the thinking within MI6 post-war, which was dominated by Oxbridge types. And really, I think, Blake really didn't fit into that mold. He was an outsider. He was a foreigner. Can you just say a bit more about his background? Because this, as you show in the book, this is really crucial.
Yeah, Blake had a very unusual background. His father was a Jew from Constantinople who had fought in the French Foreign Legion and in the British Army in World War One, and as a result had been given British citizenship, although he seems to hardly ever set foot in Britain in his life. And he ends up in Rotterdam at the end of World War One, meets Blake's mother, a Dutch woman, and they get married. Blake is born in 1922 on Armistice Day, and in a fit of patriotism on the way to the registry office, the father, Albert Bihar, names his son George Bihar, Kyrene and Sephardi Jewish name. And then, the father dies during the Depression. He's never recovered from being gassed in World War One. And Blake is farmed out to the father's sister in Cairo. So he spends a few years in the 30s living in this very cosmopolitan Jewish family, speaking French in Cairo. He learns French, he learns English. And so he becomes a cosmopolitan, this Dutch boy, realizes he can cope in Egypt, he can cope anywhere in the world. And then when World War II breaks out, he joins the resistance, very committed anti-German, very pro-British, proud to be British. And becomes
he's incredibly young, isn't he? I mean, how old is he at this stage, at the beginning of the war?
When the war breaks out, he's 17, and he's briefly interned, then he joins the resistance. And he looks like a schoolboy. So, in his kind of shorts or +4s, I suppose a bit like Tintin, he goes around the Netherlands in trains, delivering illegal newspapers and messages. And he's very good at it. He learns about the secret life, and he's good at keeping secrets. And he enjoys being a man of mystery, but he feels, I'm made for greater things. I'm going to be a spy. That's my vocation. I mean, he thought when the war ends, I'm going to become a Calvinist pastor, because he was a very pious little man. And he wants to be a spy in the big leagues, and that's in London. So he thinks the British Secret Service is this secret organization that really runs the world. Britain is this superpower. I'm British, and I want to join the Secret Service. So SIS, it was called then. So amazingly, he escapes through occupied Europe, through Belgium and France, into Spain, gets on a boat, winds up in London at the end of 1942 and 1943. And he does actually join the Secret Service, the Secret Intelligence Service.
That in itself is the fact that he was in the resistance so young, and then joining the Secret Service. It's a sort of an impressive start. He was very comfortable. You talk about his international background, but he seems to be he's very good, as you say, at his craft, but also shifting allegiances, and that sort of fits in with his cosmopolitan background.
Yeah, I mean, he's very much a Dutch patriot, but he's also proud to be British, and he admires very much the British war efforts in World War II. And really, he begins to change at the end of the war. I mean, he goes back to the liberated Netherlands and then on into occupied Germany in 45. And if you're an Allied soldier spy then, there was a lot of partying. You had access to liquor. There was a lot of wine, women, and song available to the occupying British. And he felt after a while, look, I'm not fit to become a Calvinist pastor anymore. I've, dabbled too much in bad stuff. But SIS wants him as a spy. He speaks very good German as well. He speaks French. And so in Germany in 1945, he begins to realize the new enemy now for the British is the Soviet Union. And he has to use former Nazis, German former Nazi naval officers, send them as spies against the Soviets in occupied Eastern Germany. And he feels uncomfortable about this because the Soviet Union were the good guys. They've been on our side in the war. And now I'm working with ex-Nazis against them. And he starts to feel this is wrong. But, he's a spy, and the British send him to Cambridge to study Russian. He studies Russian, and then he sort of falls in love with Russia, with Russian literature, with the country, with the religion.
And that happens before he goes to Korea, which is obviously where essentially he gets recruited because he gets captured. But you're saying that his engagement, his love for Russia actually predates what happens in Korea.
Yeah, so he spends about 9 months in Cambridge, 1947-48, because SIS say, look, Russian is going to be the big language of espionage. We have very few people who speak it. George is good at languages. George goes to Cambridge to learn Russian. He does. I mean, within 3 months, he says he can read War and Peace in Russian. Having spent a year learning Russian, I know that's quite an achievement. Spent a year trying to learn Russian. And so he desperately wants to use his Russian, but SIS in their wisdom sent him on his first foreign posting to South Korea. and they know that the Korean War is going to break out, and they want George to stay there and observe the coming war. But Blake doesn't speak any Korean, doesn't really have any interest in that part of the world, and he's frustrated to be sent there. And then indeed the Korean War breaks out, but the North Koreans take him prisoner.
And that's the crucial bit. Now this is the really interesting bit for me, because this is the conversion bit, if you like, and perhaps I don't know, we are going through the contents of your book, and if you haven't read it, it's still really worth reading it. It's a fantastic book. But there, he's taken capture. He is held with there's some other diplomats there and some other British soldiers, and essentially the KGB managed to recruit him. What do you think was behind that? What motivated that recruitment? And that he's clearly under very difficult circumstances. But I just want to get your analysis of that moment.
The Korean War is a very shocking experience for him. I mean, he sees the American planes decimate villages. I mean, enormous numbers of Koreans were killed in that very brutal war, and many by American planes. And he starts to feel, the Americans are the bad guys. The Americans are like the Nazis bombing his hometown, Rotterdam, in 1940, 10 years earlier. And the North Koreans, the communists, they're like the Dutch resistance. So his loyalties begin to shift. He sympathizes with the underdog. And then after this horrible death march and seeing these bombings, he ends up in this farmhouse in North Korea with nothing to do, with some British and French diplomats. And after a while, they get a package of books from the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang. And that's very formative. And there's only one book in English, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. So they're very excited, and they draw lots about who gets to read it first. And they read us all to pieces. And there's also a couple of books in Russian. There's Marx's Das Kapital in Russian, and Lenin's State and Revolution. And Blake and the British consul, Vivian Holt, can actually read Russian. So they sit on a grave mound and they read Marx and Lenin. He actually reads Marx Das Kapital twice in Russian. And he's convinced. He thinks, yeah, Marx got it right, and communism is the future. And the British consul says to him, regrettably, I agree with you. And Blake thinks, look, I could die here in Korea. This is a battle of good against evil. I want to be on the right side, and the communists are the right side, he feels. So I think it was an absolutely genuine religious conversion. And I say religious because I asked him, I said, look, really what you seem to be doing to me is you're exchanging your Calvinism for communism. It was one faith for another. And I expected him to say, no, that's nonsense. And he said, yes, that's absolutely right. So I was adopting communism like a new faith.
And you don't get a sense that, I mean, you're talking about a man who's got conviction, but the other interpretation of it is this was a man who, under substantial pressure, wanted someone to save him. And he's, as you've indicated, his ability to change allegiances, but also to change identities. He's very fluid. He's very good at it. And here is somebody offering him, a different form of patronage. Why not take it?
Yeah, I mean, he tried to escape at one point, and the North Koreans capture him and bring him back. And so one theory is, well, they said to him, well, you've got to spy for the communist side, otherwise we'll kill you. But I mean, there's various reasons why that's unlikely to be true. They probably wouldn't have dared to kill a British diplomat. And he, all his life in different circumstances, including after the fall of the Soviet Union, when communism had collapsed, he kept saying, no, I was a man of conviction. And I think it rings very true to the person he was. He was a believer. Blake was somebody who, from childhood on, had a very strong faith. And Calvinism for him was very similar to communism. It's all about everything is predetermined in Calvinism. And in communism, history is predetermined. And in Calvinism, there's a paradise that we go to when we die. And in communism, there's a paradise that can be attained on this earth where everyone is equal, like in the communist paradise. So to him, communism was like a kind of form of primitive Christianity. So I think the appeal it had to him it fits very much with the kind of person he was. He was an ideologue. He was a believer. I don't think Blake was a cynic.
So he comes back to London. He actually does a sort of hero's welcome when they're released and returned to Britain, and he goes back to goes back to working for MI6. While I'm saying this, please can you? I'd love everyone to start putting your questions in the Q&A box just here or wherever it is on your screen, so we can start putting your questions to Simon soon. So he comes back to Britain and he immediately goes to work. And the amount of information that he produces is quite considerable. Can you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so in 1953, he's released. You know, all the prisoners are released after Stalin's death. There's this kind of thaw. Comes home, has a holiday, and then he begins working for MI6 in their London office, but really working for the KGB. And he photographs every document he can lay his hands on. He has this miniature Minox camera. And at lunch, when all the others go out to the pubs and clubs of the West End, he closes his door and he photographs the documents. And then he hands them in these kind of film noir scenes to his Soviet handler on the top deck of London buses or in deserted suburban stations. And what he gives the Soviets is, I mean, he tells them about the Berlin Tunnel that the British and Americans digging under Berlin to eavesdrop on Soviet conversations in 1954. And he gives them the name of every single spy for the British that he knows about, working mostly behind the Iron Curtain. He gives them hundreds of names of British spies. And he says himself, he said later he didn't know how many names he gave because he gave them every single name he could lay his hands on. And later when MI6 unmasked him, when they realized in 1961 that he'd been spying for the KGB for 8 years, they tried to do a damage assessment. And they worked out that of the hundreds of spies he'd given away to the Soviets, probably 40 of them had been executed. So Blake was a well-meaning man who became a de facto serial killer. Probably 40 spies working for Britain, mostly, you know, East Germans, Bulgarians, Czechs, that kind of thing, died because of him. Others spent long times in prison. And then, as John le Carré has also written, le Carré comes into the service just as Blake is being exposed. Le Carré, all his life, was fascinated by Blake and actually read my book before he died and gave me his comment. Le Carré said the other thing he did was that, as you know, Nicholas, he gave away the names of British people working in head office. So many of the people in MI6 head office were known to the KGB, and therefore that hampered their whole careers.
Yeah, I identified for the rest of their careers. Quite incredible. I'm going to come back. I'm going to want to come back to you on your sort of cross-examination of his sort of moral, his culpability, if you like, in the end, and that's something you do in a way towards the end of the book. But before we get there, the amount of material that he produced for the KGB was huge, and in some cases they just, well, in a lot of cases they didn't act on it.
I mean, this is always a problem with spying. And the Cambridge 5 spies, and Blake knew some of them later in Moscow, you know, the Ganaram, Kim Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, they produced so much information as well that the KGB didn't actually have the resources to process it. I mean, it was in English. KGB didn't have many English speakers. And there were suitcases full of documents that they didn't get round to. And the other thing is that the KGB never quite trusted it, because the KGB had these brilliant double agents, Blake and the Cambridge 5 mostly, working for them in Britain. The KGB had access to pretty much every British secret for about 2 decades, but it didn't quite trust the material. And this is one of the basic problems with espionage. How can you trust a double agent? How do you know that he or she is really working for you? Maybe they've been set on you by the British. And so there was this enormous suspicion, partly because the material was so good. I mean, the stuff these guys were sending to Moscow was so good that the KGB had to distrust it. And so it didn't pay off for them quite as well as it might have. And the other thing is that, so Blake betrays the Berlin Tunnel. Blake says the British and Americans are going to spy on all your communications from Berlin. And the KGB don't actually want to close the tunnel, because then the West will know that the KGB have a mole in London and they might identify Blake as that mole. So for many reasons, they couldn't use this brilliant material, or much of it, that Blake and the others were passing on to them.
There's so much more to talk about here, but I want to bring some questions in a second. There's one chapter of this story which is worth a Netflix series in itself, and that's the escape from Wormwood Scrubs prison, and also his relationship with the Irishman Sean Bourke. Can you just tell us a bit about, well, first of all, tell us about the escape. Tell us about Blake in prison and its impact on prisoners around him.
Yeah, Blake's whole life is like a Netflix series, and his escape and his relationship with Sean Burke, the Irishman, is actually a play by Simon Gray called Cellmates, which is very good. So Blake, is exposed by MI6 and is given the longest jail sentence in British history in 1961. He's given 42 years, the longest jail sentence in modern British history at that point.
And in contrast, how many of the Cambridge Five have been sentenced to a prison sentence, and if so, for how long?
The total jail sentences of the Cambridge Five are 0 days. None of them was ever, even after some of them confessed, Ken Cross and Anthony Blunt, none of them was ever jailed. And Blake, I think, rightly thought it was because they were insiders. They were mostly upper class blokes. They were the establishment, and he was the outsider.
So Blake, a foreigner too.
Yeah, a foreign Jew with a funny accent. Yeah. And so Blake is given 42 years. And he actually felt, being convicted was completely fair. He felt his trial was fair. He thought it was an example of British fair play. And in jail, he becomes everybody's favorite prisoner. He's one of the few educated men in Wormwood Scrubs, and he teaches the other prisoners Arabic, French, and German, and they come to him in his cell and ask him for advice. He writes letters on their behalf to the authorities. He's a hero. He's a prison professor. And meanwhile, secretly, he's cultivating allies because he knows, I'm going to get out of here. I'm not going to do 42 years. And he finds Sean Burke, who's this, in some ways, brilliant, creative, mercurial Irish petty criminal. And Burke hates the British, and he wants to help Blake escape because he liked Blake and he hates the British establishment. And also he thinks, this is going to be my real life work of art. I'm going to write a book about this escape, which he does. It's a very good book, The Springing of George Blake by Sean Burke. And so in a very amateurish way, using walkie-talkies and a rope ladder, they get him out of Wormwood Scrubs, which isn't difficult. In the 60s, everyone escapes from Wormwood Scrubs. British jails are kind of leaky vessels. And they hide him around the corner in a bedsit, and then they hide him in the home of peacenik, Pat Postle, had also been in jail with them.
But just a few streets away from the prison. I mean, it's just cool.
Yeah, I mean, literally around the corner from the prison in Shepherd's Bush. And it's just a fantastic escape. Everyone in the whole British police force is looking for him. He ends up hiding with Burke in Hampstead. And then they drive him, the peaceniks drive him in a camper van, hidden under the floor of a camper van from London to Berlin, where he walks up to an East Berlin border guard and says, I want to speak to someone from the KGB. And it's such a spectacular escape. I mean, he is world news in 1966 that Hitchcock thinks, I'm going to make a movie about this. And he should have done. So Hitchcock buys the rights to Burke's book and another book. And he spends the last decade of his life working on a film about Blake, about Blake's escape, with, I think, initially Sean Connery and Liv Ullmann as the stars. And then unfortunately, Hitchcock becomes senile and dies before he can do the film. But the script exists. So I hope one day somebody is going to make this film. And Blake, by some miracle, makes it to Moscow. And then the peaceniks send Sean Burke along as well, because Burke is a very blabbermouth kind of guy, and they don't want him spilling the beans in England. So they send him to Moscow for a cooling off period. He and Blake end up living together in Moscow. Doesn't work out brilliantly. And Burke eventually makes it back to Ireland and publishes his book. Yeah,
Burke absolutely hates Blake and describes him as sort of doing exercises in front of the mirror in his apartment. And there seems to be no love lost there. The other bit I loved was the children going in the camper van, because they're all going on holiday together to Berlin, have to play games about the friend who appears and disappears underneath the platform that's been built under the seats in the back of the van. It's hilarious. Let's bring in some questions, and then I'm going to come back to questions about how Blake viewed this all towards the end. His culpability, his view of life. It's, communism collapsed around his ears. The cause for which he fought, the cause for which he betrayed so many people, collapsed. Yet he wasn't openly critical of it afterwards. Let's take some questions. So there's Georg Blaha, who is somewhere in Germany. Go ahead, Georg.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can see. You got a lovely cap on.
Yes, yeah. The energy prices. It's cold here. No, it's a great book. I only started reading it recently, so I'm not yet through it. But it's a very interesting story. And what I was wondering about from a German perspective, in Eastern German newspapers, there were big obituaries about George Blake when he passed away late last year, but I'm not sure what his relationship was to the Eastern German spy service. I read from Markus Wolf, the Eastern German spy chief, the biography during lockdown, and he mentions George Blake only briefly. So I wonder if there is maybe more to this cooperation with Eastern Germany, since he also escaped to Moscow via Berlin, as I understand.
Simon, his appearances before the Stasi old boys to give him a chat about the British spying, that's another vignette out of Netflix.
Yeah, so Blake spent a couple of years in the mid-50s in West Berlin, and he'd go to East Berlin, supposedly to recruit Soviets for MI6 and East Germans, but in fact to tell them his secrets. And he didn't work with the Stasi. I mean, he worked with the KGB, and the KGB very much treated the Stasi as a kind of junior service for which they had contempt. They didn't tell the Stasi anything, including not telling them about the Berlin Tunnel. And you mentioned Markus Wolf. I mean, Wolf knew Blake, knew Philby, not well because they weren't East German assets. But Blake's relationship with East Germany really blossoms after retirement when he's living in Moscow. Blake speaks very good German with a Dutch accent. And so the Stasi would invite him as a kind of celebrity Eastern European spy, but once a year from about 76 to 1980 to come and give talks in Berlin. And for Blake, I suppose this was a great, holiday escape, getting out of Moscow for a week or so. And he'd go to Berlin. I've been through the Stasi files. And of course, the Stasi being the Stasi, they themselves assembled an elaborate file on Blake. I suppose they assembled files and everyone's there, was their nature. Weirdly, this file was largely consisted, when I got it, of articles in West German newspapers, which Stasi used as a good source. And then the Stasi brilliantly filmed Blake. Blake would give a lecture to the Stasi once a year, and brilliantly the Stasi film it. So that I was able to watch all that. And Blake tells the Stasi the story of his life and his motivations and everything. And it was great supplementary material. But yeah, I mean, for Blake and the KGB, the Stasi were a kind of third division team, and the KGB were the Premier League.
Yeah. Susie, you another question as well, please. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi, thank you very much, Nicholas. I hope this is a movie because he sounds like a fascinating character. I'm curious. In your research, did he ever express any kind of remorse for betraying MI6, for betraying, the British service? And also, I mean, he had a family. He had an English family. I think he divorced his wife, and he had some sons. Was there any reconciliation with them?
Great questions, Sue. Great questions.
Mm-hmm.
Very good questions, which I deal with in the book. So. Did he express remorse? I said to him, are you sorry about anything? And I didn't want to say, are you sorry about, you probably sent 40 people to there. So I said, I was trying to keep him talking and be open and friendly. So I said, do you have regrets? Are you sorry about anything? And he said, I'm sorry about everything. I think he actually meant, he said it in Dutch, I think what he meant is, I'm sorry about all sorts of things. He said, I'm sorry for the suffering I caused my family, his first wife and his sons. I mean, his wife, he left her with 2 small boys and a third on the way when he is arrested and jailed for 42 years. He's also sorry at having let down his colleagues in MI6 because he liked them and he respected them. And he wasn't anti-British at all, so he kind of felt bad about betraying them. He didn't talk about the agents he sent to their deaths, and his story always was that it was nonsense, nobody was killed, he told the KGB not to hurt them. I think he did tell the KGB not to hurt anyone, but of course the KGB just ignored it and didn't pay any attention to that. So in order to remain functioning, because I think Blake was quite a kindly man who didn't like violence, he denied to himself that he'd caused these deaths. So yeah, he did acknowledge some regrets, mostly relating to family and former colleagues. And there was a reconciliation. So he hadn't seen his son since they were small boys, and one he hadn't seen at all, the one who was in his wife's belly at that point. And then in the 80s, the middle son writes to him in Moscow and says, look, I'm curious to meet you. You know, you're a traitor to our nation. And I think the middle son was in the lifeguards, a very conservative British figure. But he said, I'd like to meet you. So the son goes to Moscow and they meet and they talk into the night and they weep and they reconcile. And the son says to his two brothers, you should go and see him. And from the 80s until Blake's death, the sons reconcile with and visit Blake all the time. And he gets to know his grandchildren in England. And he told me, he said, that is the happiest thing of my life, happiest thing about my life, that I have had a second family here in Russia. He had a new wife and a son, and I reconcile with my first family. And he actually weeps when he's talking about that. And amazingly, when he turned 90, according to the New York Times, I've been able to verify it, he turned 90 a few months after I met him. His first wife, Gillian, who had been in MI6 herself, flew out, she would have been nearly 90 at that point, to Moscow to attend his 90th birthday. So I suppose that's a completed life when you betray your nation and your wife, but she comes and forgives you decades later.
Yeah. The other fascinating thing, the obvious thing to say, is that the cause for which he fought failed. And not only that, the kind of regime that is introduced into Russia is arguably authoritarian and opposed to the very values that he says he believes in. How does he justify that?
Yeah, so Blake acknowledged that communism had failed. And, you know, he said that within a week of arriving in Moscow in 1966, 67, he realized this whole thing doesn't work. And he'd given his life for an ideology that was just produced a horrible, repressive, poor society. But he got over that. He was a guy who always looked forward. He was positive. He loved Russia itself, if not communism. And he said, he really believed in ideas. He was a man of ideas. He was a dangerous ideologue. And he said communism was worth it as an experiment because it was something the human race needed to try out, and maybe in future centuries when humans are more mature and advanced, we'll be ready for communism, be ready to share everything. But as it is, human nature isn't ready for communism. So he couldn't even regret the millions and millions, killed by the brutality of communism and the disastrous societies it produced. He said it was still kind of worth it anyway. I mean, he was a man who thought more about ideas than about people. And in his latter years, once Putin had come in, I mean, he loathed Putin. He thought,
but there's a convenience to that, isn't there? There's a convenience. I fought for the cause. It was the right cause, and it didn't work out. Not my fault. But then you get this. Doesn't he get the same response when it comes to Putin as well? I mean, he basically doesn't go. He doesn't want to go enter anything that's going to be critical of what he's done or of the situation he's in.
I think his feelings about communism were different from his feelings about Putin. So he thought communism was great and beautiful, but it didn't work. He thought Putin was just a cynical, murderous thug without any beliefs, which I think is correct.
But he didn't say that. He wasn't going to say that, was he? I mean,
no,
he wasn't going to stay true to his beliefs to that extent.
No, and by the time I met him, I think he was a cynic. He had become more of a cynic. He had stopped being interested in politics and ideas, and he turned inwards towards family and walks and music. And the reason he interviewed me in the cemetery before he agreed to let me come and see him was he didn't want me to ask him about Putin, because he didn't want to say in a newspaper that Putin was a cynical thug, because he got his pension and his wife's pension and their dacha from Putin, and Putin would occasionally give him a medal and make a nice speech about him. And so, yes, he didn't want to go on record saying anything nasty about Putin. I mean, by the end of his life, he had become much more of a kind of self-preserver than he had been in his younger years.
Yeah, I think we've actually been to the area where you went to interview Blake on our political study tours. We've got to know various members of the GRU. Funny enough, they seem to take an interest in us. And we've been invited to some great meals with a former colonel in the GRU in a dacha, I think very close to where Blake was. So it's a nice area, nice leafy area just outside Moscow. We've got a good question here from Mary Range. But she can't come online, so I'm just going to ask the question for her. She says she's finished the book. It's great. Could you speak to the his relationship between, so Blake's relationship with Philby and also MacLean?
Yeah, so Blake didn't know Philby and MacLean until he got to Moscow, and they were exiled there as well. And they'd been there for decades. And he was rather contemptuous of Philby because, you know, Philby had been a very senior figure in MI6. Blake had been much more middling. And then in Moscow, Blake was able to speak Russian, and Blake was a cosmopolitan who could adapt. And Philby was very much an Englishman. You know, Blake said to me, he got the Times delivered every day, and he'd read the cricket reports, and he'd do the Times crossword. And Philby never quite adapted to Russia. And then he had these periods of heavy drinking. And in fact, Blake and his wife introduced Philby to his last wife, Rufina, because the KGB felt that he needed a woman to take care of him to stop him kind of disappearing into drink. And they fell out in the end, Philby and Blake, when Philby's son took some photographs of a relaxed day at Blake's dacha. And then the son sold them to the Observer. And the Blakes were very angry about that again, because it upset Blake's ex-wife and sons. And so he never spoke to Philby again. This happened in about 76. They were both very secretive men, so it was hard for them, I suppose, to break out of their shells. And MacLean became his soulmate. He loved MacLean. He adored MacLean. He saw MacLean as an idealistic communist like himself. And they talked about how communism hadn't worked in the Soviet Union, but a real humanistic communism was possible. And they hoped, well, Blake hoped it would be Gorbachev. MacLean had died just before then. Blake was the last person to visit MacLean in hospital. He had in his library, I mean, he had this library of MacLean's books where Blake and I sat. These kind of great English classics, H.G. Wells and Dickens. And he had MacLean's cloth cap lay on one of the shelves. It became a kind of relic, and he saw MacLean as this saintly figure.
What do you think his assessment of Philby's motivations were? I mean, if Blake was an idealist, what was Philby? What were Philby's motivations from his point of view?
I think he saw Philby as in it more for the excitement and the thrill of spying, and he saw Philby as more of a cynic. And I mean, I think it's true that for Philby, the KGB was the most exclusive club you could possibly join. You know, Philby belonged to all the clubs. You know, he was Westminster and Oxford and MI6, BBC. You couldn't get more establishment than Philby. But even the British establishment struggled to get membership of the KGB, and Philby had managed that. So I think that Blake saw himself as a true believer, and Philby is not a true believer, and therefore is a bad person.
We've got Diane Cook, hopefully who can bring up a question from her in just a second. I've got, here we are, Diane Cook, there we go. Go ahead, Diane.
I'm just unmuting, sorry about the delay. Do you think that Simon, the British Secret Service, could ever have sussed him out? Because you talk about him being an ideologue, and it seems to me his ideology is completely the opposite of what one presumes the British were looking for, and that nobody seemed to have twigged that.
I mean, they recruited him in a different era. They recruited him during World War II, and he was a genuine anti-Nazi who wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. And you know, what was on his CV, he was a man in his early 20s. He'd been in the Dutch resistance, and he genuinely was. I mean, Rebecca West has this, you know, completely inaccurate chapter about him in her book, The Meaning of Treason, where she suggests he was a Nazi double agent. All nonsense. He was a genuine Dutch resister. And then he also, very importantly for the British, was the son of a war veteran anyway, a decorated, I think, war veteran, his father, Albert Bihar. And so not only had he had a good war, which, you know, made him very acceptable to SIS, but so had his father in the First War. And what that didn't take account for is the changing world after World War II, when you enter the Cold War, when he was no longer on the British side. What the British didn't realize is that Blake was not a British patriot. He was an anti-Nazi, and later, not when they recruited him, but later became a communist. So yeah, they kind of took him on, and then he became a different person, and he became that different person in Korea while in their service. What they should have done is, when he came back from Korea in 1953, they should really have interrogated him and given him a very full debriefing and thought, you know, has this man's views been affected? Has he been in contact with any communists while in Korea? because this was after Burgess and McLean had fled to Moscow. This was after Philby had been, fingered as a likely KGB agent. This is when some of the atomic spies had already been exposed. So, like Klaus Fuchs. So this is a time when the British knew there are communist spies in our midst. Maybe Blake is one of them. And in 1953, when he comes back from Korea, they just let him off scot-free.
That's incredible, that bit. Ultimately, when they do track him down, Blake is almost famous for making his confession. It's worth talking about that, because why was he so ready to give it up? Philby seemed to enjoy the game of denying things as much as possible until he was given the opportunity to run away. But with Blake, he sort of blurts it out and says, "Look, I wasn't pressured to do it. I chose to do it."
Yeah, it's a very famous moment, and Blake's confession is played, or was played for decades, to new MI6 recruits as an example of MI6 work. And so what happens is they recall Blake from Lebanon, where he's studying Arabic and he's top of his class, wonderful students of Arabic. And they bring him in for what he then realizes is an interrogation in London. And it's led by a man called Harry Shergold, who was an MI6 legend. And for about a day and a half, they say to Blake, "Look, we know you're a KGB agent." And Blake does deny for a day and a half. And then he breaks when the interrogators say, "Look, you couldn't help it. The North Koreans, forced you to do it. They tortured you, and then they forced you to become an agent. Not your fault." And he's very offended, because he's very proud of his idealism. And he wants his colleagues in MI6 to know he's a real idealist. He's not, some opportunist who just breaks under torture and becomes a spy to stop the torture. So he says, no, I did it out of belief, and nobody made me do it. Nobody gave me any money. I became a KGB agent of my own accord. And at this point, Shergold and Leckie and the other man, John, can't remember his surname, they look at each other in disbelief, because Blake has cracked. He's given it all away. And cleverly, they don't say, "Oh my God, Blake, you were a Soviet agent." They say, "Oh, really? Tell us more." Because when somebody says something surprising, you learn this in journalism as well, the best response is to show no big surprise, but just to kind of nod encouragingly, not say too much, and let them do their own interior monologue, exteriorized. And Blake does. And he just tells them everything. And then they call up to a policeman from Special Branch who are waiting in the basement. And Blake confesses to them. So now his confession is on the police record. And then it's going to be very hard for him to avoid jail. And one reason why he went to jail and Philby didn't is Philby wasn't dumb enough to confess.
That's a key. I mean, just pursue that for briefly. If they'd chosen to bring Philby back from Beirut, which was where he escaped to Moscow from, could they have opened up a case? What would have that involved?
Yeah, so both Blake and Philby are caught or summoned back in Blake's case from Lebanon. Blake in 1961, Philby in 1963, by the same man, Nicholas Elliott, who's an MI6, bureau chief in Beirut, who is, of course, like everyone else, an old friend of Philby's. So Nicholas Elliott persuades Blake to go back to London, where Blake blabs. And Elliott goes for dinner with Philby. And he does get Philby makes a very selective, partial confession. "I worked for KGB for a couple of years in the war, and then I stopped, and I didn't give them the real stuff," that kind of thing. And then Elliott makes it clear to Philby, "Look, you're not going to come back to London. Easiest thing for everyone is if you just do a fade. You just get out of here to Moscow." He doesn't say that, but that kind of is the unspoken message that Philby understands. So Philby does what Blake had only considered doing and legs it from Lebanon to Moscow, where he has, in a way, a much worse punishment than spending many years in jail. He spends 25 years, the last 25 years of his life, in the Soviet Union and can never return to his beloved Britain, the country he betrayed, but the only country where he felt at home.
Yeah. We've got questions from Roma Hooper. So Roma, we're going to put you up as a panelist. And if you say you don't want to talk, tell me. but we're going to put you as a panelist now so you can ask your question. But while we do that, in the meantime, I've got another question which has been sent in from Victoria Barkley, who's not able to listen, but she sent them a son. Who was the governor of Wormwood Scrubs at the time of Blake's escape, and what were the consequences for him? We presume it was a him. Of course it was a him. The prison service and also the Home Office. I have a dim recollection that there was information father's secret relating to this, only to be available many years from now. What do you know about that, Simon?
Yeah, the governor, whose name escapes me, had actually written a letter saying, you know, Blake should probably not be here. He should be in a more secure prison, and we must always regard him as an escape risk. So he wasn't a complete fool. But British prisons were very leaky ships. Blake's own theory was that the British didn't worry too much about people escaping from prison, because once you escape from prison, you're still on an island. And so on the whole, the Brits are able to get you back. I mean, one of the prisoners who escaped in the months around Blake's escape was a bloke known as Frankie the Mad Axeman, who, after escaping, began to write letters to the newspapers. So it was quite an anarchic time. But then they realized, you know, after Blake goes, that we really do have a problem with prison security. Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, is given a hard time in the Commons by the Conservatives. Jenkins points out that the Conservatives themselves didn't have an unblemished record of secure prisons. And I think it's Mountbatten is commissioned to write a report about prisons, the result of which is that British prisons become much more secure, but also more brutal places, where the kind of liberalism of prison visitors and easy access to classes and that kind of thing is taken away from the prisoners, and prisons become much more miserable and oppressive places as well as more secure, something that Blake himself would have regretted, but he was a cause of. So I don't think the governor is to blame so much as the entire system.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm actually going to turn to somebody now who does a lot of work on prisons and the very issues you just been talking about.
No, it's actually Christopher, it's Bruce.
Ah, it's Bruce. That's Bruce.
Yes.
Bruce. So, Bruce's better half knows a lot about prisons and prison policy, but Bruce knows nothing, so we can't talk to Bruce about that.
No.
Bruce, you got other questions?
But I do. I've actually read the book, Simon, because we did it for our book club. I also watched the two-part series on Philby and the Cambridge 3 just the other night, which was fascinating, and it was amazing how Eliot was so well. He was the biggest backer of Philby all the way through. So I don't know whether it helped him when he let Philby go. But what I wanted to know was, and I read your book, The Happy Traitor, some time ago. Was there a sort of a pecking order? Did the KGB rate the assets in Moscow? You know, were they ones given more freedom than the other? Were there, you know, given more facilities than the other ones? And was there jealousy between Blake and Philby?
There was jealousy, but I mean, you've got to remember that once these people arrive in Moscow, they're essentially useless to the KGB. They no longer have any access to British secrets. The British know that they are Soviet spies. So really, they are redundant. There's nothing more of use they can do, and they're just a burden on the KGB, which has to feed them for the rest of their lives. And so, you know, there was some jealousy. Philby resented that Blake was given the Order of Lenin before, when Philby wasn't. Philby was given a big newspaper interview in his vestio when he arrives. Blake wasn't. So, you know, these men with too much time on their hands, very kind of ambitious, but their career's over. They did engage a lot in these petty jealousies. And Philby, of course, saw himself as superior to Blake because he'd been more senior, and also because he was upper class and Blake wasn't. Blake saw himself as superior to Philby because he could speak Russian and adapt, Philby couldn't. So I think there's a whole kind of drama to be written about these useless old men.
I love the bit about Philby going to work for some kind of foreign wires service, and is outraged that an editor dared to change his copy.
Yeah, so Philby saw himself as a great expert on the Middle East, and his father, St. John Philby, complete lunatic, who had been married to a slave girl who had been given by the King of Saudi Arabia, but who'd spent a lot of the time going around the Middle East. So Philby writes this article about the Middle East for this Soviet news bureau. And of course they censor it because that's what the Soviets do. They take out stuff they don't like. Philby is outraged. How dare anyone censor, my brilliant writing? And so he essentially retires from Soviet journalism and never writes a word again.
And the other thing, surprise, surprise, is the shock at life in the Soviet Union and Moscow, which is, got a lot more than some other cities. But getting to adapt to that, the actual shock for that for many spies is quite profound.
Yeah, so the best line on this is Guy Burgess. He's sent to a provincial town first when he arrives in the Soviet Union in 1951, I think it is. And Burgess says that life in the Soviet Union is like Glasgow on a Saturday night in the 19th century, which I think is probably quite accurate. And, these spies have very privileged lives. So Blake had this wonderful dacha where I interviewed him. He also had a very nice flat on a tree-lined street in Moscow, things that not everyone had. He had access to these special kind of, I think, hard currency sort of stores or stores for the nomenclatura, where you could buy, cheap Russian champagne and that kind of thing. But still, it was pretty terrible. I mean, it wasn't London in the 60s. And so, yeah, that was a big shock to them all.
For those who don't know, most of you must know, but some might not know, Simon is a very well-known columnist on the Financial Times. He does a weekly column in the FT's magazine and writes on a huge wide range of things, and also has several books out on football. And my hope is that we're going to pin Simon down and shock, talk about football and the business of football, which is something I'm looking at more closely in another interview. Tell me, I mean, you knew that you were going to write this book way back in 2011. Did you have an idea that you were going to write it back then?
No, I mean, so in 2012, I walk out the door and I fly home to Paris, where I was living then and I'll be living again. And I say to my wife, I met this amazing man. And she says to me, it sounds like he's charmed you. It sounds like he's a serial killer who charmed you. So I think, yeah, you're right. And
you were good because beforehand you were going to send him herring and other Dutch delicacies.
So as I leave, we have this very Macy moment, and I said, you've come a long way, Mr. Blake, from your childhood near me in the Netherlands. And so we have this quite, we pass as friends in a way. We've got on well, and he told Sharon that he liked me, I liked him. And then I say, look, I'd like to send you something from Holland because you haven't been back to Holland in, 50 years and you'll never go back, 60 years. And he says, if you could send me some herring or cheese, that'd be really nice. And I say, yeah, I will. I'm going to look into it, see how I can send it to Moscow. And I really mean to at that moment because I like it. And so when my wife says, look, he's a serial killer who charmed you, I think, yeah, you're right. And so, but anyway, I was never going to write a book. I was going to write this article, and then I spend, as I say, all my free time, getting my kids to bed and taking them to the playground and stopping them hitting each other. And, the kind of thing you do as a young father for years and years. No chance of writing books. And then in about 2016, this idea is still in my head. This guy, I can't forget about him and that day. And I'm starting to read about his life more and getting really gripped, obsessed by it. And suddenly I realized I'm not spending every spare minute in the playground anymore. And I think, I'm going to look into this book thing. And so I go to the Stasi archives, I read everything I get my hands on. Blake's file, MI6 file, is closed and probably will remain closed for the rest of my life because MI6, I think, is so embarrassed by having had this traitor in their midst for 8 years that they don't want anyone to write about it.
How does that work in terms of the files being released? Generally, what's the sort of period of time that they would release information on about this kind of period?
I think it's usually the 30-year rule that after 30 years, government documents are released if there's no specific reason to keep them. But, Blake's activity in MI6 ended 60 years ago this year with his arrest in 1961. And there's still no sign of anything being released. I mean, occasionally you'll get a document that, some Home Secretary said something about Blake. But you don't get what Blake actually did. And partly the embarrassment for the Brits with all these double agents was vis-a-vis the Americans, because of course we were the poodle, we were American poodle, and every time it turned out that the Brits had another double agent who'd given away not only their own secrets, but also America's secrets. It was a source of enormous embarrassment. Luckily for the Brits, just as Blake was unmasked, the Americans had their own huge intelligence embarrassment with the Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion of Cuba. So the Americans had other things to worry about just then.
Yeah. This is a tricky question. You write articles that assess of trends in society. You look at all sorts of questions in quite an abstract way. But just thinking about this subject, thinking about spying and MI6, and also in Britain's spying services, MI6 in particular. What's changed? Do we still have the same tendencies? I mean, I'm asking you to have a big sort of overview of that period of history. And it's now 60 years on since then.
What has changed? I think the main change is that spying, like everything else, has gone digital. So it's it's been automated, and so now it's a matter of hacking into. I imagine that the MI6 is hacking into Russian systems, just as the Russians are hacking into British and American systems. And so the role of these individuals still exists. It's probably less important. The other thing that struck me during the Trump era is that in the Blake and Philby era, the Russians are very, very excited when they have a middling member of MI6 handing them secrets. Now, in the Trump era, I mean, not to speculate about the Donald himself, but just think of these times when he's at Mar-a-Lago and the president of the US is running around Mar-a-Lago having all these conversations on his own cell phone much of the time in this private club. Now, as Max Boat, the American journalist, wrote, any foreign intelligence service that didn't have spies among the cleaners and waiters at Mar-a-Lago was doing an enormous, professional disservice to itself. So never would it have been easier for the Russians to get stuff from very top level as it was 2016 to 2020. So, in Blake's day, they dreamed of having someone in the White House, having somebody in Downing Street. It was a fantasy of some people at MI6 that Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, was a KGB asset. He wasn't. But, so now you have the digitality and you have much more access to the top than you did in the 50s and 60s.
Okay, great answer. Ted, you've got another book out at the moment, just on Barcelona. Is it just called Barca, the book? What's the book called? In
the UK, it's called Barca, and in the US, it's the Barcelona Complex. It's about the rise and now very spectacular fall of what we call the world's greatest football club, written from the inside. Like with Blake, I managed to get someone on the inside there.
Fantastic. And do you have, what's your, have you got, without giving too much away, any other ideas, new book ideas coming up?
Almost finished. I've had a very productive pandemic. A book about the British elite and how it was made in Oxford in the 80s, the British elite and Brexit. And the book is provisionally titled Chums, and it will be out early next year. Oh, that sounds fantastic. That sounds an excellent one. We'll certainly start booking you for that one. Listen, thank you very much indeed, Simon. We're gonna wrap it up early this evening. It's been a wonderful pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed the book. There it is again. You can see the link in the chat box if you haven't got it already. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Nicholas.